The mouse of the day is Airplane Andy, and the first time he ever flew this plane, he wasn't even sure if he was going to survive. He's a very brave mouse, but he's also a very lucky mouse, and please stick around until the end of this video to see what happened to Airplane Andy on his first trip, but I think it's only right that we start at the beginning. Airplane Andy was the first mouse to ever fly, and no, I'm not talking about with wings. Mice really can't do that, but no, Andy was the real deal. He piloted the first ever mouse-built airplane, and this was made out of cheese, as you can see. It's a very solid design, but this is one of the future designs, and there are some other mice flying around with him. When he went out, he was on his first trip all solo, so he used an older model, and it was even more dangerous, actually, because it was just the very first prototype. It was made out of Gouda and Swiss, constructed by Richard Harrington. He was smart, but let's say some of the areas of his brains were a little bit holy, like the Swiss cheese that he used to build this plane. So Richard's been working on this project for years, right? He's been tinkering in his underground lab, shaping slices of Gouda into aerodynamic wonders and creating this contraption that honestly looked more like a cheese platter at a fancy party than an actual airplane. Now try and picture this plane. The wings were carefully carved slices of Gouda. They were so smooth, the smoothest slices of cheese you've ever seen, and it just gave it the perfect aerodynamics. There were holes actually in the cheese which helped with airflow, and it helped lighten the plane so that it could move at top speed and not really get any wind resistance or anything. And for the wheels, you guessed it, tiny crispy cheese crackers. I kid you not, it was like someone turned the entire contents of their lunchbox into a mode of transportation. And honestly, it worked pretty well, except for one big problem with it. Now enter Andy. Andy wasn't exactly your average mouse. He wasn't a scientist, he wasn't an engineer, he wasn't particularly bright all around, but he had a great sense of adventure and a strong sense of confidence, which is what he needs to fly this plane. He'd always been the one in the village who would just jump off various ledges, dive into puddles, and generally do things that no other mice in their right mind would do. He was very fearless, so naturally when Richard came along looking for a test pilot for his cheese plane, Andy was all in. He saw the plane, gave it a once-over, and with the kind of confidence only a mouse who had no idea what he's getting into can have, he said, "Let's do it, I'm all in." Richard, of course, was over the moon, or in this case, he was over the wheel of cheese. He was so happy. He gets Andy into the cockpit, which was just big enough for him to sit in, no bigger. And let me tell you, this thing didn't have a lot of room. Andy really had to wedge himself in there with his tail awkwardly stuck in the back, and the sides were really scraping against him, but it was okay. There was one lever to make the cheese plane go up and another to steer, but there were not very many instructions on what to do if something went wrong and not very many controls in general. It's a simple plane, but that didn't faze Andy. He was grinning ear to ear. He was so happy to fly this plane. The entire mouse village gathered around to watch as he was about to take off. There were murmurs of doubt. Sure, I mean, come on, it was a cheese plane. Some mice thought that this was the greatest idea since sliced cheese, while others were convinced that they were about to witness something very, very terrifying. The world's first mid-air fondue disaster. They thought that this actually might melt and he'd come crashing down. So there's Andy sitting in his cheese plane ready for takeoff, and Richard stands off to the side holding a giant wheel as if it were a trophy, watching him proudly. He was just about to take a big bite to celebrate the takeoff. He gives Andy the go-ahead and pulls the lever for him so Andy can start moving. For a second, nothing happens, and there's a moment where everyone thinks the whole thing might be a giant, embarrassing failure, and he might not even be able to take off. But then suddenly, the cheese-powered engine starts running. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, the engine was made out of cheese. The inside and outside was made out of cheese, and this was a little bit ridiculous, but honestly, it worked pretty well. It would run super efficiently, and it was lightweight. I don't know exactly how it worked, but it was something about a Brie compression system and a smelly reaction involving mold. Who knows, but when it kicked in, it was powerful, and it would roar, and it would send you flying at the speed of light. Just after a little bit, the engine started to really get going, and he took off. He was flying, it was really working. The crowd lost it. All the mice were squeaking, jumping up and down, their tails flaring all around. They were just so excited, and no one in the village had ever seen anything like this, so they were just extremely excited. Andy's up there soaring a solid 20 feet above the ground, and for a mouse, he's actually touching the clouds. He's really high. This is basically the sky for him, 20 feet up. He was like swooping left to right. He was doing tricks all around, doing barrel rolls. No one could believe what they're seeing. A mouse flying a plane, a cheese plane? Yeah, it's really cool, but here's the thing. No one, not Richard, not Andy, not a single mouse watching, thought about the fact that, well, cheese melts, especially when exposed to heat, and this is an engine getting really hot. So after a while, it did start to have some problems, and it was producing way more heat than anyone accounted for, so this was getting very unsafe for Andy. So while Andy's up there having the time of his life, after a few minutes, the cheese plane starts to, well, soften. It's subtle at first. One of the Gouda wings gets a little droopy, like someone left it out in the sun for too long or left it in their lunchbox overnight, but Andy was completely oblivious. He kept flying around like nothing was wrong at all. And then the melting really starts. It was oozing, and it was just gooey getting all over the wings and dripping down out of the plane. Those wings that were once aerodynamic wonders were now just turning into fondue. The cracker wheels were a terrible idea to begin with, but they were crumbling into dust, and the whole thing is turning into what looks like a melted cheesy pizza in the sky. The mice on the ground started shouting to warn Andy, "Andy, it's melting, it's melting!" But he couldn't hear them. He's too busy living his best life, still waving to the crowd like he's some kind of mouse celebrity. He's just having the time of his life. But as the plane's structure starts to dissolve a little bit more, it starts to wobble. You can really see it, and Andy starts to notice the right wing dips a little bit lower, and finally it just snaps off completely. Now, imagine you're Andy. 1 minute you're the first mouse to fly, and the next you're realizing that you might not have much more time to live. Your plane is literally melting all around you. The left wing follows, and it starts to droop and eventually fall off, and Andy enters a nosedive. Not just a gentle descent, this is plummeting towards the ground at top speed. Andy's pulling on the controls trying to make something happen, but there's no wings left. It's just too late. Nothing's ever going to happen. So there's no saving a cheese plane once it starts to melt. The whole thing's falling apart like a grilled cheese sandwich in the microwave for too long. And Airplane Andy is right above the crowd, so they're really scared. They don't know if they should try and catch him or if they should just run. They really care about Airplane Andy, but they don't want to get hurt either. Andy's holding on for dear life, and at this point, it's just a pile of cheese with a mouse inside that's all melty. But here's the thing. Andy gets lucky. He doesn't hit the ground. Instead, he lands smack in the middle of a giant tree stuck in the branches, and it hurt, yes, but he's alive, and that's what matters. The crowd rushes over expecting the worst, but there he is dangling from a branch covered in what used to be his plane, now just a pile of cheese. The scene is hilarious. Mice are running around trying to figure out how to get him down, while others are just laughing at the situation all around because he's actually perfectly fine. He's a strong mouse, and he had a good landing. Cheese is dripping from the branches, and some of the more opportunistic mice are grabbing bits of it for a snack because they do like to scavenge. I mean, waste not, want not, right? After what feels like an eternity, they finally manage to get Andy down, and he's shaken, sure, but surprisingly, he's okay. He's feeling pretty good. Considering he just fell from the sky in a melted cheese plane, he's doing pretty good. They lay him on the ground, and Richard comes running up, still clutching his giant cheese wheel. Andy sees Richard and says, "Hey, can I have a bite of that cheese wheel?" Richard says, you just fell from the sky, but sure, you can have a bite." Airplane Andy, though, is pretty nonchalant, and he just really wants a bite of some delicious cheese. He doesn't really care that he fell from the sky. But that's the story of how Airplane Andy became the first and probably the last mouse to fly a cheese plane. Well, the old design, that is. The designs kept getting better and better over the years as Richard Harrington improved on them. So this is a model that still works today. Actually, yes, you can fly in one of these cheese planes, but don't even think about trying the prototype model from Richard Harrington because they do not work well. You definitely need a little bit of metal between the cheese and the engine because you don't want this melting on you. Do you guys mess with the Airplane Andy? And please like and share this video. Please.